Judy Becker, talk about recreating the 50s in Todd Haynes' Carol.
Well, the Carol takes place in 1952 in Manhattan mostly, and on a road trip. And the main thing about 1952 in Carol is that it's really the 1940s. It's the post-war period. It's the pre-Eisenhower period. So the brief from Todd was that this is not really the 50s we normally think of. It's not the popularized 50 Happy Days or American Graffiti or Mad Men. It's really a post-war traumatized society still trying to recover from that period and sort of unsettled as the characters are unsettled. So we looked much more to reference from the 1940s and colors from the 1940s and to earlier periods than to what we normally think of as the aesthetic of the 1950s.
Mm-hmm. Well, talk a bit about the research that you did in preparing for this film.
Um, There were a lot of different levels of research. One of the things that we did was scout in New York City, where I live, with Ed Lockman, the cinematographer, and Todd. We looked at the original locations that we needed to replicate in the movie. So we spent about a week doing that, looking at Bloomingdale's, which Patricia Highsmith had based Frankenberg's on, and the area around there, and seeing what remained of that era and what we needed to match in Cincinnati. We looked at the New York Times building below Times, and we went out to New Jersey and looked at the house that the original Carol person had lived in. So we did all of that. And then we started looking at a lot of documentary photography from the era, especially Saul Leiter and Ernst Haas and Evelyn Hofer, Esther Bublé. I we really wanted a planned yet naturalistic look for the movie. So it was really important to find out what New York looked like in that era and match that in Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed you're working with a very specific color palette as well in this film. Can you
Yes.
talk a bit about that?
Yes. Yes, I have a very large collection of vintage paint chips and paint decks that from the 20s through present 80s really, and I took that with me to Cincinnati, and right away we talked about using a very limited color palette. Most of the colors in the movie are going to be the natural colors of the environment, so the brick of the buildings and the cement of the streets, the wood of the wood walls, and then within that, what color palette were we going to choose? And we decided to choose a palette very based on popular 1940s colors, but the dirtier versions of those, still accurate to the period, but you always have to make a choice. I mean, if you look at a vintage paint book from that period, there's hundreds of colors in it. And so choosing which direction to go in was an emotional choice. What's going to emotionally express the world of these characters? And we picked the sort of sour and acidy greens and yellows and the dirtied pinks and these kind of unnameable colors to represent this very emotionally unsettled world that these characters are inhabiting, not just the world of New York and America in that time period, but these characters don't know who they are or where their lives are going at that time. So that was very important, and I really hope that the color palette manages to evoke that. The other thing that was important about the use of color was avoiding too many or saturated colors so that the times that you use those, they really stand out. So Carol's red lipstick or Carol's red fingernails or Therese's yellow and red hat. You really remember those things as defining the characters because you don't see those colors anywhere else in the movie or very rarely.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, you have to portray the differences in lifestyle between Carol and
Yes.
Therese. Can you talk a bit
Yes.
about that?
Yes. Well, clearly, economically, they live extremely different lives. And Carol has a big house, beautiful wall coverings, and very nice furniture. And Therese lives in a walk-up apartment with her bathtub in the kitchen, and she has to brush her sink in the kitchen sink and turn on the stove to heat it. And that was based on real Hell's Kitchen apartments. It was supposed to be on the Far East Side, but I had shot in some real Hell's Kitchen apartments when I was starting out in my career around 1990, and remembered those bathtubs in the kitchen and really wanted to incorporate those because that was something very important for that era. And but the thing that, so they're very different, and Therese doesn't, she has no real personal identity at that time. So we made a conscious choice that her walls would be painted tinted whites and very bland, like nothing colors, say putty and white and off-white. Eventually that changes when she repaints her apartment after the breakup with Carol, and sort of picks this turquoise that's going into the later 1950s. The thing that they both have in common in terms of sort of a general design look is a certain austerity that is partly, Therese doesn't have much money, and Carol's not really at home in her house. She's getting divorced. She doesn't really, her situation's really changing. So it never feels like a loved, lived-in place. But what's really accurate about it is that it's really true to the early 50s and to much later periods as well. People didn't have a lot of material possessions. And I think that that's something that's hard for contemporary audiences to embrace and to realize, that sometimes these sets look bare to people, but they're accurate, and that's how people really lived. It was not a throwaway materialistic culture. And I think that's something that is very important to recognize when designing a period movie, and something I'm very, very conscious of.
Mm-hmm. You've worked with Todd Haynes before on
Yes.
I'm Not There, and I'm just wondering what it's like working with someone who has a very specific visual style, a very strong visual sense, especially in production design. Can you talk a bit about that collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic to work with Todd. He's a director I've admired so much since I first saw Superstar when I was just starting in the film business, and he was kind of just starting in the film business too. He was about to make Poison, and so I've always loved his movies. I've always thought he was an amazing filmmaker, and he's wonderful to work with. He brings so much to the table. I mean, he comes in with a book of references. He knows what he's trying to achieve in the movie in every single craft and in every single way, and everything is planned. I mean, when you see the finished version, you realize how important every single detail was. Sometimes you're wondering while you're making the movie, and then you see the movie and you're like, oh yeah, now I get it. And it's, so he goes on every location scout. He's involved with the color choices. He's very, very involved. And we have a lot of the same cultural references, Todd and I, the same movies, the same photographers, same books, the same phases that we went through in high school. So it's really, I think that we have a good kinship, and I think that it's really joyous to work with him.
Mm-hmm. This film has a lot of relevance to today. I mean, you look at what's going on in the world today, even though the events are 50 or 60 years removed, I mean, it's still a struggle for people like Carol and Therese to be together, even though we have,
Yes.
Gay marriage legalized in all 50
Yes.
states. There's still several opponents to that. Can you talk a bit about that?
About the political conditions of contemporary society?
Yeah, and I mean,
Or how
that
that
relates to the film.
Um,
In 30 words or less.
big topic. Designer, I think that. Oh, that's a tough one. I mean, there's been a lot of movies made about same-sex relationships in the past few years. I think that, I know that one thing Todd is proud of with this movie is that it has what could be considered a happy ending, or as happy an ending as any romance can have. It's not, we all know, any of us who have been in romances, it doesn't last like that forever. It's like, I think Rooney said at a Q&A the other night, the hard part's going to come 3 years down the line, which is very true for every relationship. But I think the fact that, they end up together, like they make a choice, and what a daring choice to make at that time. I think that is so admirable. And I think that for me, the way that relates to contemporary society is not so much with same-sex relationships, although that's definitely an issue for many people, especially many people in the Hollywood industry, but just with people being willing to make an unpopular choice and to go against the grain. And I think that we all feel the pressure to conform to society's expectations in certain ways at certain times. And would that we really had the democratic America that it's supposed to be, where we're all free to choose what we want, how we want to live our lives. But sadly, we don't.
Right. Well, thank you so much, and congratulations on the film.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm proud of it and happy to have worked on it. Thanks
Well,
very
it's a
much.
great movie, so thank you.